Can silence hold fire in its chest, waiting for the night when it will finally breathe? Can a man chained in body but not in spirit turn the overseer's feast day into his funeral pyre? And can a single match, struck in the stillness of July, burn louder than a nation's drums of freedom? Georgia, 1822, Independence Day thundered with parades in the town square, while laughter and music poured from the white man's house, swollen with pride. Yet on the edges of that same land, beneath the weight of centuries, another silence stirred, an old silence, patient and cold, waiting for its moment. And when it came, the overseer's house would blaze like a warning to all who thought silence meant surrender. Before we step deeper into this haunting tale of vengeance and silence, pause with me. These are not softened fables nor gentle recollections. They are scars etched into memory, debts written in fire, and echoes that still whisper through time. If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. Now the silence deepens. The land groaned beneath the heat. Georgia in July did not whisper, it pressed down like a hand, heavy and merciless, on every blade of grass, on every bowed back that bent in the fields. Cicadas screamed like rusted hinges, their endless song filling the emptiness between commands shouted from horseback, and in that endless drone there was no melody of freedom, only the grinding of bodies against soil that was not theirs to claim. The house of the overseer stood tall on a rise of dry earth, its whitewashed boards gleaming under the sun as though it were untouchable, immune to decay, its shutters rattled when the wind dared pass, like teeth clattering in secret warning. From its porch the master of the place could see all rows of cotton stretching outward, labour stitched into the land, and the cabins where the enslaved huddled. Isaac lived in one of those cabins, a square of wood and shadow no larger than the belly of a ship that once carried his father across the ocean. The floor creaked like brittle bones, and when rain fell it slipped through the cracks of the roof, dripping into bowls already scarred by fire and use. Yet silence lived there too, not peaceful silence, but the kind that thickened the air, heavy with unsaid words and unscreamed cries. At dawn the bell clanged, its iron tongue knew no mercy. The sound did not call men to worship or to feast, it pulled them from shallow sleep into another day of breaking their bodies, on land that would never feed their names. Bare feet struck the dust, leaving prints that the wind erased as quickly as they came, as if history itself conspired to forget. The fields had no pity. Cotton bolls tore its skin until hands were lined with tiny scars, raw as open mouths. The sun wrote its brand on shoulders, searing them until even sweat burned like salt in a wound. Overseer's whip sang above it all, a sound sharper than thunder, quicker than breath, and its echo curled in the lungs of every soul who worked beneath it. Independence Day brought no freedom here. The irony twisted in the air like smoke. In town, white men toasted liberty, their voices raised in songs of triumph, while in the fields men and women bent lower, worked faster, carried the weight of another man's pride. Fireworks cracked in the distance, but for Isaac each burst only sounded like chains snapping shut. The overseer himself, a man swollen with arrogance, strutted among them in his linen coat, his boots sinking into the same dust that clung to Isaac's feet. He drank from a flask that gleamed like silver, and spit words that stung sharper than his whip. He laughed loudly, his voice carrying across the fields as though it owned the air itself. He had a way of laughing after he punished someone, as if pain were a joke only he understood. Isaac did not laugh, he did not speak. He moved with the silence of a man who had learned that words were stolen before they left the tongue. Silence was his shield, and his silence unsettled those who watched him. But he listened, every insult, every order, every groan of the house when the overseer walked its halls. He took them in and stored them away, like tally marks on an invisible ledger. At night the cabins dimmed. A single candle might flicker if wax could be spared, but often there was only the glow of the moon through cracks in the wood. Families huddled close, whispers soft enough to dissolve before reaching the walls. Children clung to scraps of songs their mothers hummed under their breath, lullabies without words, carried in tones that spoke of places they had never seen but somehow remembered. The air carried more than music, it carried grief. Names of the lost were sewn into silence, remembered in the way a hand lingered on a scar, or how a glance shifted toward the forest's edge. Sometimes in that stillness Isaac would look to the horizon, where trees bent like old men and the night insects sang. He would stare until the world blurred, and he could almost see fire rising there, not yet burning but waiting. The overseer's house stood as a symbol. By day it shimmered with false promise, by night loomed like a coffin propped on a hill. Its windows glowed during feasts, spilling laughter and candlelight into the dark, taunting those who lived without either. Every creak of its boards, every groan of its roof in the wind seemed to Isaac like the sound of something alive, an arrogant creature, swollen with cruelty, daring anyone to challenge. The land was soaked in rhythms that repeated endlessly: sun up, toil, sun down, silence, whip, silence, hunger, silence. The only breaks came in storms, when rain battered the fields and lightning split the sky. Isaac found comfort in storms because, in those moments, the overseer's voice was drowned, his commands silent. Thunder spoke louder than the whip, and the world for a heartbeat seemed equal. But storms ended, silence returned, and the overseer laughed again. The days carved themselves into Isaac's memory like scars carved into skin. He remembered each: the frost that cut through thin clothes in January, the choking dust of May, the suffocating July heat. He remembered the creak of the overseer's boots as they crossed the wooden porch, the way the whip cracked just before it struck, the faint smell of tobacco that clung to cruelty. These were not details, and silence was how he remembered them, how he kept them safe. In Georgia, 1822, silence was not absence, it was present, it was resistance. It was the gathering of storms yet to break, and in Isaac's silence, the overseer's house had already begun to burn. Isaac did not count the days as others did. Calendars belonged to the men in the big house, their pages marked with planting, harvest, and feast days. For him, time was carved differently, etched into skin, pressed into silence, and tallied in the dark corners of his mind, where words never reached. His calendar was a ledger, not of seasons but of pain. Every scar had its date. The first stripe of the whip across his back, left when he was barely more than a boy, carried the year in its raised edge. The overseer had punished him for slowing in the field, though his hands had been raw, his body trembling with fever. Isaac never forgot the way the lash curled across his shoulder blade, leaving a crooked line like a river on a map. He traced it with his memory often, not with sorrow but with patience. That was entry number 1. His ledger filled slowly. There was the time his sister, barely 12, was dragged across the yard for spilling water. The overseer laughed while she sobbed, the whip biting her thin arms until the skin opened. Isaac had watched, unable to move, silence burying the scream that clawed at his throat. He etched it in his ledger. Not just the pain, but the sound of her cries, the overseer's laughter, the way the house windows flickered with candlelight, as though the cruelty inside the yard were entertainment for the walls themselves. The ledger did not forget hunger, the memory of nights when cornmeal ran out and the children sucked on cloths dipped in water to ease the ache. The overseer's dog ate better than the men and women who worked the fields. Isaac remembered the sound of bones cracking between the dog's teeth, and he marked it in silence. Another debt. Silence became his ally. Where others groaned or cursed under their breath, Isaac held his tongue. He let quiet gather around him like smoke. The overseer mistook it for weakness, but silence was a blade Isaac sharpened in secret. Words could be stolen, twisted, beaten out of a man. Silence could not. Silence waited. He learned to see what others did not, the way the overseer's house creaked most loudly when the night was humid, the spot on the porch where the wood had splintered, catching at the heel of a boot, the storage shed where oil was kept in barrels, the steam sharp even from yards away. Every detail entered the ledger, not as idle observation but as numbers on a balance sheet of vengeance. Isaac carried memories the way others carried tools. His mother's face, worn yet strong, bending over a pot that barely steamed. The lullaby she hummed, low and wordless, cut short when the overseer's shadow darkened the doorway. The night she died, taken by fever while the house above them feasted. Isaac did not weep aloud. He only pressed her final breaths into silence and wrote the overseer's indifference into his another entry, another debt unpaid. The overseer's laughter was the loudest sound in Isaac's life. It clung to him even in dreams, dripping like water through the cracks of his mind. Sometimes he woke in the cabin, heart pounding, sweat soaking the straw beneath him, and in the silence that followed he promised himself, one day the laughter will stop. His body itself was a record. The whip had left maps across his back, the sun had branded his skin in shades of labour. His palms bore calluses thick as bark, but deeper than skin, deeper than bone, Isaac kept memory alive. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight, as if dredged from a well too deep for casual talk. The other enslaves knew this, and though they rarely asked, they sometimes glanced towards him when the overseer's cruelty shot, as if they, too, trusted his silence. He never spoke of vengeance aloud. The cabins had ears and the walls of the overseer's house were not deaf, but within himself Isaac repeated the ledger. Each insult, each wound, each absence of mercy, it all lined the pages of a book no one else could see, and in that book he saw the sum. The balance owed was heavy, too heavy to ignore. Independence Day came each year like a mockery. The overseer drank himself bold, shouting about liberty while men and women bent double in his fields. Isaac watched from the shadows, the smell of gunpowder from fireworks drifting across the night, mingling with the stink of sweat and ash. The overseer's house glowed that night brighter than any skyrocket candles in every window, music spilling from within. It stood like a torch against the darkness, and Isaac knew one truth, one day, that torch would burn itself down. Silence shaped his waiting. When others despaired, Isaac remained still, his faith unreadable. The overseer taunted him for it once. "Cat got your tongue, boy?" and struck him across the mouth. Isaac tasted blood, but he swallowed it without a sound. That moment became another entry, a mark that would not fade. He wondered sometimes if the overseer could feel it, that every cruelty was not passing but being written, carried and weighed against him. Isaac's ledger was not just personal, it carried the weight of others too. His sister's wounds, his mother's hunger, the hollow eyes of children bent over sacks too heavy for their small backs. He was keeper of more than his own pain. He was witness, and witnesses do not forget. Night after night he rehearsed it in silence. He saw the house, proud and tall. He saw it blaze. He saw the overseer's laughter turn to screams. He saw debts paid in fire. The vision came not as fantasy, but as inevitability. Like the rising of the sun, like the return of heat in July. And so he waited. Each day that passed, each scar added, each whip crack endured. It was not weakness, it was patience. Full of debts, full of promises, full of the ledger grew, and with it so did the certainty that one day The overseer's house would fall silent forever. The days leading to Independence Day, 1822, unfolded with the same grinding rhythm as all before them. Dust, sweat, the whip cracking through air heavy with heat. Yet beneath that sameness, something shifted in Isaac. His silence began to harden, to take shape. His ledger of pain had grown fat with debts, and the time to balance it drew near. He did not announce it. Vengeance, like fire, begins as a spark hidden in darkness. It needs quiet, shelter, patience. Isaac carried it inside himself the way one carries a coal in the palm, smouldering yet ready to set the world alight. He studied the house. By day he was made to haul wood there, to carry water, to mend tools in the yard. The overseer, too careless in his arrogance, never thought to fear a man who bowed his head and said nothing. But Isaac's silence was a mask, and behind it his eyes measured everything. The creak of the stairs, the way the oil lamps were stored in the pantry, the pitch of the roof, the path the wind carried in the evenings. Every detail entered his secret ritual. He found cloth scraps discarded in the yard, bits too frayed for use in the house. To others they were trash. To Isaac they were kindling. He tucked them beneath the floorboards of his cabin, hidden in the dark where no eye would search. He found strands of rope left from binding hay bales, stiff but willing to burn if coaxed. He wound them carefully, knotting them like prayers whispered through his fingers. At night, while others slept or whispered in the dark, Isaac stayed awake, weaving silence into purpose. He traced the scar across his shoulder and imagined it as a match. He touched the walls of the cabin, feeling the grain of the wood, hearing the faint whisper of fire that could one day consume beams like these. He breathed slowly, as though inhaling not air but the memory of smoke yet to rise. The overseer's laughter during the feast echoed louder as the day approached. He boasted of freedom, of liberty, of his own strength. He spoke of the nation's greatness while Isaac bent double at his feet. Each word was another spark, another lash against silence. Isaac did not look up, but in his mind he saw the house already burning. He gathered fuel in secret, not piles too obvious. Instead he carried a piece here, a scrap there, always under the guise of duty. A bit of straw left on his clothing after tending the stables, a splintered plank hidden among the firewood, a trail of nothing that, when stitched together, would form the bones of an inferno. Oil was harder. The overseer kept it in barrels near the shed, watched loosely but enough to make theft dangerous. Isaac did not rush. He waited until one evening when drunkenness clouded vigilance. The overseer had celebrated early, flask in hand, stumbling as he cursed at the hounds. Isaac slipped near the shed, scooping a rag full of oil, letting it soak until it dripped heavy. That night he buried the flask beneath the dirt floor of his cabin, covering it as though it were treasure. Each object was small, unimpressive on its own, but Isaac saw them differently. In his hands a rag was not cloth but a torch. A flask was not vessel but weapon. Every piece he gathered was a verse in the liturgy of vengeance. He assembled them like a priest preparing for a sermon, careful, reverent, knowing the weight of each symbol. The silence around him grew thicker. Others noticed but said nothing. They saw the way he moved, slower, heavier, as if carrying a secret too large to put down. Some glanced at him with questions in their eyes, but no words passed between them. Perhaps they feared the danger of speaking aloud what silence already knew. Independence Day dawned with brutal heat. The fields shimmered beneath the sun, cotton like scattered bones across the land. The overseer strutted, drunk already, waving a small flag as though its colours excused the lash. In town, bells tolled and drums rolled, declaring liberty for some while burying chains deeper into others. Isaac worked with his usual stillness. His silence was unbroken, but within it his preparations stirred. He felt the oil flask pressing against the earth under his cabin, The rags wound tight, the rope coiled like a snake ready to strike. Each item was hidden, yet their presence thrummed in his blood, steady and certain. When the sun fell and the overseer's house swelled with music and laughter, Isaac's ritual neared its end. He did not eat. Hunger no longer troubled him. His belly was filled with fire. He washed his hands at the pump, the water cold against calluses, as if cleansing himself before a sacred act. He sat in silence for a long while, listening to the night. The cicadas had quieted, the air was still. Even the dogs seemed uneasy, pacing as though they sensed the shift. Isaac retrieved his hidden items, cloth, rope, oil, each in its place, each touched with care. He held the flask to his forehead for a moment, a silent prayer passing through him. Not to the God of the overseer, who blessed cruelty, but to something older, something that spoke in storms and fire. Then he rose. The walk to the house was short, but each step was long, echoing through silence that seemed to expand with him. He passed the cabins where others slept or feigned sleep, their breathing shallow. He knew they heard him, knew they felt the air tighten as he moved. None spoke. Silence was their gift to him. The overseer's house loomed, its windows glowing with candlelight, its laughter spilling into the dark. Isaac stood at the edge of the yard, staring. The house was not wood and nail to him, it was a beast, bloated with arrogance, groaning with every injustice it had witnessed. Tonight it would be fed to fire. He circled to the shed. There in the shadows he dipped the rags into the flask, soaking them until oil ran down his wrists. He wound the rope around them, binding flame to fuel. His hands did not tremble. They moved slow, steady, reverent. This was no crime, no accident. This was judgment. When he struck the flint, the spark leapt like a star falling into his palm. The cloth caught, small at first, then swelling, eager. Isaac stared into the flame, its glow reflected in his eyes. He whispered nothing, but silence itself seemed to bend closer, as though listening. He walked to the base of the house. The wood smelt dry, hungry. He pressed the torch to it. The flame licked, tasted, then bit. The boards sighed as though they knew their fate, as though they had been waiting all along. Isaac stepped back, watching as fire crawled upward, threads of orange stitching across whitewashed walls. The house groaned, beams cracking in protest, glass shattering as heat swelled. From within, the laughter faltered, turned to shouts, then screams. Isaac did not move. He stood still, silent as ever, ledger in his chest. The overseer's debts were being paid, each crack of timber another entry balanced, each flame another scar erased. The night sky lit with fire, brighter than any Independence Day firework, and in the glow Isaac's silence burned louder than all the overseer's laughter combined. The torch was no longer in Isaac's hand, yet the fire clung to him as if it had chosen him, as if silence itself had found a tongue at last. Flames licked along the baseboards, first like whispers, then like shouts, orange teeth biting into whitewashed wood. The house, proud in daylight, now shivered under its own bones. At first the laughter inside carried on, muffled by music and liquor. Fiddles shrieked, boots stamped against the floorboards, and voices bellowed songs of freedom. But the fire was patient. It spread like a secret, crawling along corners, slipping through cracks, breathing into the dry ribs of the house. Smoke rose, thin at first, then thicker, curling against the windows like dark fingers. The overseer's dog barked, a frantic howl that cut through the music. Still the guests clapped and shouted, thinking it nothing more than the hound's usual noise. Isaac stood in the yard, motionless, watching. The night around him was alive. Cicadas had stilled, owls kept silent, as though even the creatures of the woods bore witness to this moment. Then came the crack, the sound of timber splitting under heat. A sudden hush fell inside, laughter choking into confusion. Another crack, louder, like a gunshot, glass shattered, flames clawing at the curtains. Screams followed, ragged, human, sharp as the lash that had written itself into Isaac's back. The house woke in terror. It moaned, every beam groaning, the fire running up its sides like veins filled with molten blood. The porch sagged, its proud planks buckling. The roof, once a shield, now trapped the heat, pressing it downward, suffocating the revellers inside. Isaac's eyes did not flinch. The overseer stumbled onto the porch, shirt half open, face red with drink and sudden fear. For the first time his laughter was gone. He shouted orders, waving his arms as though the fire could be commanded like a slave. The flames only roared louder, snapping back at him with sparks that landed on his coat. He beat at himself, staggering, cursing. His voice carried across the yard, no longer confident but broken, frantic. Isar remembered every lash that voice had delivered, every insult spat with it, every command shouted from the height of arrogance. Now it cracked, high-pitched, desperate, a voice stripped. Others poured out behind him, guests with dresses catching sparks, men choking on smoke, their celebrations turned to chaos. They screamed into the night, clawing at the ground, eyes wild with the reflection of the inferno. The overseer's wife clutched her pearls until they snapped, beads scattering into the dirt like lost prayers. A boy tripped on the stairs, rolled into the yard, his hair aflame until someone smothered it with a coat. The overseer tried to rally them, shouting to fetch water, to form lines, to save what could not be saved. Barrels were overturned, buckets thrown, but the fire was already king. Each splash of water hissed and died in the blaze, swallowed by the roar. The house screamed louder. Rafters collapsed, sending showers of sparks skyward, a mockery of the fireworks bursting in town. The smell of burning wood mingled with roasted meat, and the guests gagged, some retching as they fled. Shadows darted across the yard, frantic silhouettes against the blaze. Isaac did not move. His silence was an anchor in the storm. His eyes reflected the flames, but his body remained still, as if rooted into the soil. To him, this was not chaos, it was balance. Every scream was a tally erased. Every crash of falling timber was a debt paid. The overseer stumbled toward the well, shouting at Isaac, "You, boy, move, bring the bucket, help." His voice cracked under the weight of desperation, words slurring with liquor and fear. Isaac only stared. The silence between them stretched vast, heavier than the smoke, more suffocating than the heat. It was then the overseer seemed to see him, not as a shadow, not as a tool, but as a man standing in stillness while his world burned. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, horror, the dawning realization that the ledger had been kept, and tonight it was being closed. "Help me!" he shrieked, voice hoarse, spittle shining on his lips. He dropped to his knees, coughing, eyes watering from smoke, but Isaac gave him nothing. No word, no step, no hand. Only silence, silence that screamed louder than the fire, silence that carried centuries within it. The overseer rose again, wild, stumbling back toward the porch, as if the house could still shelter him. But the house had turned traitor. Flames poured from its belly, beams collapsing like ribs broken inward. The doorway yawned, a mouth of fire, swallowing the man who once believed himself untouchable. He screamed as he vanished inside, his cries smothered by the roar of the flames. Isaac watched. He did not smile, he did not move. His face was carved in shadow, his silence eternal. The guests scattered into the fields, some wailing, some fleeing into the woods. Behind them, the house gave its final sigh, a deep groan as the roof caved inward. Sparks shot into the night like spirits freed, rising above the yard, above the cabins, above the land itself. For a moment the fire lit the sky brighter than the moon, a beacon not of liberty as the town had declared, but of reckoning. Smoke towered, black and endless, blotting out the stars. In the cabins the enslaved stirred. Some pressed their children's faces into their shoulders to keep them from seeing. Others watched, eyes wide, silent prayers forming behind their lips. No one spoke Ivik's name, no one cried out. Their silence was not fear alone, it was recognition. They knew what the fire meant. They knew what debts were being paid. As the roof collapsed entirely, sparks rained down upon the yard. The air swelled with heat, with the stench of ruin, and through it all Isaac stood unmoved, a dark figure against a wall of flame. He was not man alone in that moment. He was ledger, he was silence, he was vengeance given breath. The house groaned one last time and fell in on itself, timbers shrieking like bones snapping. A storm of embers spiraled upward, 1,000 tiny suns scattering into the black. The overseer's world was gone, devoured in less than an hour. And in the stillness that followed, silence returned, not empty but full of screams that no longer echoed, full of debts that no longer weighed. Isaac breathed in the smoke and exhaled the fire's last whisper. His ledger had spoken. The fire died slowly, not with a whimper but with a long, rattling breath, as though the house itself were reluctant to let go of its arrogance. By dawn, the overseer's proud white boards were nothing more than ribs of blackened timber, jutting like the bones of some colossal beast slain in the night. Smoke still curled upward, thin and stubborn, carrying with it the stench of ash, oil, and flesh. The yard was quiet, too quiet. No music, no laughter, no barking of dogs, only the hiss of embers and the restless shifting of cicadas returning to their song. Where once the house had ruled, silence now reigned. But silence, in Georgia, was never empty. At first the enslaved kept to their cabins, eyes lowered, voices buried deep in their throats. Children clung to their mothers, asking questions in whispers. The adults gave no answers, they only shook their heads, pressing fingers to lips. What had happened in the night was not to be spoken, not yet. Words were dangerous. By mid-morning, neighbours arrived. They came on horseback, drawn by the pillar of smoke that had split the sky through the night. Their horses stamped nervously at the charred ruin, the animals' instincts recoiling from what human curiosity pressed toward. The men dismounted, boots crunching on ash, eyes wide as they surveyed the wreck. "What devil's work is this?" one muttered. Another spat into the dirt. Lightning, maybe, the Lord's own strike. Yet there had been no storm. The sky had been clear, the stars sharp and bright, until smoke swallowed them. Still, the neighbours clung to the lie, for it was easier than believing what their bones already whispered, that vengeance had walked among them, silent and human, and had set the house ablaze. The newspapers took up the tale days later. "Tragic fire consumes estate," the headlines declared. "Independence Day celebrations end in calamity." They spoke of accident, of carelessness with lamps and oil. They named no culprit, but between the lines, between the ink and the ash, a different story spread. The enslaved knew. They said nothing aloud, but in the slow moments between work, when backs bent and hands bled, they passed the knowledge in silence. A glance held longer than usual, a hand brushed across a scar, a child hushed with a look instead of words. Silence carried it better than any tongue could. Rumours spread among whites as well. Some whispered of sabotage, of shadows seen near the house before it burned. Others swore they heard no footsteps, no voices, only the fire itself, moving as if alive, as if called into being by the weight of centuries. The overseer's name, once shouted in arrogance, was now spoken only in hushed tones, tied to ruin and humiliation. In town, on porches and in taverns, men raised their brows and muttered that the fire had been a warning. They did not say from whom, perhaps from Providence, perhaps from the very people they chained. But no one dared name Isaac. He was there, silent as always, moving through the days as though untouched by flame. If they suspected, they swallowed it, for silence can be more frightening than confession. The cabins felt different after that night. Shadows hung thicker, yet within them there was a spark, unspoken but present. Children slept closer to their mothers, but some smiled in their sleep as though soot in the air carried comfort. The men and women rose each dawn to the same toil, but their silence was not only resignation now. It had become something heavier, something sharper. It could speak again. The overseer's absence left a void. For weeks no new man stepped forward to take his place. The land grew restless without command, as though even the earth recoiled from filling shoes that had burned. Eventually another was sent, quieter, sterner, cautious in his cruelty. He walked the land like a man stepping over graves, his whip dangling but unused in the first days, as if the ashes still smoking at the rise warned him better than any sermon could. Yet fear clung thick in the air. White neighbours locked their doors at night, set dogs at the edges of their yards. Some whispered of rebellion, of fire spreading from one plantation to another. They slept lightly, ears pricked for crackles in the dark. For what had happened to the overseer's house was no longer seen as accident. It had become symbol. And symbols do not die in ash. Isaac himself spoke nothing of it. He carried wood, bent over cotton, drank water at the pump. His silence was the same as it had always been, yet something in his eyes shifted. Those who looked closely swore they saw flame there, not wild but steady, a smouldering coal that would never cool. He did not gloat, did not boast. Vengeance had no need of words. His ledger was balanced, and silence had closed the book. Still the whispers grew. It was him, some said in cabins. No, it was the Lord's hand, others countered, too fearful to place the act on human shoulders. Yet all agreed on one thing, that the overseer had not died by chance. He had been judged. Legends are not written in ink, but in rumour, in silence, in the tremor of voices lowered around a fire. And so the story of Isaac began to change. Some said he had walked into the blaze and returned untouched, smoke curling from his shoulders like a cloak. Others swore he had spoken no words for years because he was saving them, and the night the house burned he finally opened his mouth and spoke fire. Children grew up hearing fragments, never directly, never admitted, but whispered like bedtime prayers. They learned that silence could hold power, that patience could become weapon, that even the proudest house could fall. And Isaac, still alive, still silent, became both man and myth. His figure in the fields seemed taller, heavier, not because of muscle but because of the weight of what people believed he carried. Silence was no longer emptiness, it was presence. It was fire remembered. The ashes of the overseer's house cooled, scattered by wind and rain. Grass grew over the ruin, but even years later, on hot July nights when fireworks cracked in town, some swore they could smell smoke drifting from that rise, see embers glowing where none should be. For vengeance, once spoken, does not die. It lingers in silence, waiting. Years passed, and yet the ruin remained. The house that once towered above the fields never rose again. Its ashes sank into the soil, its charred timbers swallowed by weeds and creeping vines. Rain softened the blackened beams, wind carried the soot into the woods, but the silence it left behind never lifted. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for footsteps that would never return. The neighbours built new stories to cover their fear. They told one another that it had been lightning, that the Lord had sent fire as warning, that no man among the enslaved could have dared such a deed. But whispers carried otherwise. Whispers said a man named Isaac had stood silent in the yard, his face lit by flames, his voice unbroken by pleas. His ledger of suffering closed at last. Whispers are stronger than proclamations. They do not fade, they grow. In the cabins, in the fields, by the edge of the river, children who had not even seen the fire learned to repeat the story. They whispered of the night silence burned louder than laughter, the night a house groaned like a dying animal, the night vengeance took its breath. Isaac himself grew older, but his silence did not. It deepened, became a shroud he carried with him. He never told his story, never confessed, never sought glory. He moved as he always had, quiet, patient, steady. Yet his presence drew eyes. When he passed, men nodded with caution, women lowered their voices, children stared wide-eyed. He was not just man anymore, he was symbol. On nights heavy with heat, when fireflies flickered like sparks above the fields, people swore they saw him in silhouette against the horizon, a dark figure outlined in ember light. Some said he carried a torch that never burned out. Others swore he carried nothing at all, only silence, which weighed heavier than flame. When Independence Day returned each year, the enslaved bent over their work while fireworks thundered in the distance. But in their hearts another fire burned, the memory of the overseer's house collapsing in screams and smoke. Freedom had been denied them in law, but in silence one of their own had written a different declaration, and though no parchment bore his name, the land itself had signed it in ash. Legends rarely stay still. They twist, take new shapes, slip into the mouths of those who need them most. By the time decades passed, Isaac's fire had become many things. To some it was warning that cruelty could summon its own destruction. To others it was hope that silence, patient and sharp, could outlast chains. And to the children who whispered in the dark, it was prophecy that houses built on pain would one day always. Some nights the neighbours claimed they smelled smoke when no fire burned, a faint, acrid taste in the air, drifting across their porches, making their lamps flicker low. They shut their shutters tight, muttering prayers, though they knew prayers could not erase what silence had already spoken. Others swore they heard footsteps near the ruin, slow and steady, though no man was there. Footsteps that did not hurry, did not falter, just walked as if keeping time with the beating of a heart long stilled. Isaac's name was never carved in stone. No marker bore his years, no ledger carried his debts, once they were balanced. Yet his silence became immortal. The overseer's laughter was gone, burned to ash, but Isaac's silence lived on, heavier than words, sharper than flame. And so the story blurred. Was it truly Isaac who struck the fire, or was it silence itself, rising from centuries of wounds, choosing one man's hands to speak through? Did he stand in the yard and watch, or was his figure only a shadow invented by frightened eyes? Was the fire accident, judgment, or myth? The truth no longer mattered. What remained was legend. And legends echo. They echo in the crack of timber on a hot night. They echo in the hiss of embers hidden under soil. They echo in the way silence itself feels heavier when cruelty dares to laugh too loudly. In Georgia, they say, if you stand by the place where the overseer's house once rose and wait until midnight on Independence Day, you can hear it still. The groan of beams collapsing, the scream of laughter turning to terror, the soft, steady breath of sidelings keeping its watch. Some swear they see fireflies gather in unnatural numbers there, circling like sparks that refuse to die. Others say they see a man, tall, quiet, eyes reflecting flames before he vanishes back into the trees. Whether Isaac was man or myth is no longer the question. The question is whether silence itself can be destroyed, or whether it always waits, patient, ledger in hand, until the night comes to speak again. And so the legend of Isaac remains, half-truths, half-whisper, carried not by books or papers but by silence itself. A silence that does not forget, a silence that does not forgive, a silence that, even now, still burns,